Yeah. Now you tell me. Now, Ms. McCrary, the way this is going to work, you are going to tell me when I'm going to move the slide because we've got digital learners at home right now. Let me distance myself away a little bit. So we've got digital learners at home who are following along, and if they want to follow along, what they can do is go to join.nearpod.com, and they can enter in a special code that we have put in our live stream just for you. That code is P5, V as in Valentine, D as in day, R as in right. As in your right to know. All right, Ms. McCrary, let's get started.
All right. Welcome. Good afternoon. It's so good to be here. Thank you for those of you that are online that are joining in. Greatly appreciate it. I'll try and make this quick and painless, as I like to tell my students when I'm at school, anytime we have to do some lecture. So if you're following along, I really want to focus on what we know to be true about viruses. And so focusing just on viruses as a whole, what is a virus? How does it work? Really just understanding the basic and foundation before we can start to talk about and apply to the coronavirus. So I'm actually going to kind of model what I do in my classroom every day. And so you guys will notice that my lesson is modeling that so that you kind of get a real live opportunity to kind of sit in a class lesson. So as you go with us, if you'll go ahead and you'll notice that our enduring understanding for this mini lesson that we're going to do today focuses on looking at microorganisms to plants, but understanding that all of these organisms are going to vary in how they carry out different life processes. And so with that, we're going to look at a virus and we're going to look at how it is able to work and what it does. And then we're going to actually apply that understanding and knowledge to the coronavirus itself. And so there is a science practice and a science skill. I am a science teacher, and that is what we focus on. And so I want to point out that we're going to use the practice of using visual representations. So you'll notice that you'll see a lot of visuals, a lot of models. And that helps to really ground our understanding.
The sidewalk.
Sorry guys, got a little bit of interruption going on. But that really grounds our understanding in the different concepts and processes that we're going to see. And we can look at them from a theoretical standpoint, in other words, learning in terms of education, and in an applied context, so using it to understand the coronavirus itself. So there are 5 major points that I'm going to tap on today. And the first one is looking at what is a virus. So a virus is simply a non-cellular, non-living particle that is made up of genetic material and proteins. And so it's very simplistic in terms of what it's made up of, but we know that it has a very complex effect on many different organisms.
Stop.
Next slide.
All right, next slide.
Sorry guys. Hi. Next, keep going. Next one. What is a virus?
All right, what is a virus? That's right.
Good?
We got it.
Yeah, all right.
Unusual, right?
Yeah, I know, right? So we're just getting caught up, everyone, where the slides that we are so that we can really be able to engage today. And so what I'm actually going to ask you all to do to kind of start off and really kind of get us engaged in what's going on, the next 3 slides that we're going to view, and we'll view them one at a time for a couple of seconds, are going to have you look at different types of viruses. We know that viruses are classified based on their chemical properties. So again, that's that DNA or that RNA, that genetic material, and their physical characteristics, so their size and their shape. And so I would like for you to take a look at each of these 3D animations, and I want you to think about, I want you to process, what do you think about what you're seeing? What do you notice about what you're seeing? And what do you wonder about what you're seeing? So we're going to move through each slide and take about 30 seconds, give you an opportunity to, on your own device, move around and kind of see these different types of viruses, and then we'll come back and talk about what we saw.
All right,
Next slide.
All right. Wow. So now can I move this around?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so I can just move this around. I
Yes.
can look at this weird looking little monster. So what am I looking at?
So this first one that you're looking at right now is what we call as a bacteriophage. And bacteriophages are unique in that they only will affect different types of bacteria. Let's go ahead and go to the next one.
All right.
Take a moment. Feel free to move around. Use your finger to actually move around. So this virus here is actually the rabies virus. This is a rabies virus, and it's unique in its shape.
Yeah, it's all spiky. I mean, what do I know? I'm only a growth teacher. I assume it's a mean virus. All right.
So let's go ahead and go to the next one.
All right, the next virus. Okay, this one.
And so this virus is actually unique. This is a cross-section of a virus that we're seeing here. And this is a spherical type of virus. And this is an example of HIV, and influenza also has this type of shape. So I'll give you guys just a couple of seconds. Move around, look to see.
My sister teaches in Emergent Elementary in DeKalb County. And I'm very, my mother was a teacher. I was a teacher about the
Okay, so let's go ahead and let's move on, and we're going to talk about what we saw in all three of these. So as I mentioned earlier, viruses are based on, or characterized based on their different sizes and shapes and what they do. And so our first one that we saw was the bacteriophage. And again, this one's unique because it only infects bacteria. And so when you see the fancy word bacteriophage, it literally means a bacteria eater. And this guy is unique because this one is responsible for a lot of the diseases that we actually see and that we know. The next type of virus that we saw was the rabies virus, and it had the similar conical shape that we saw, or the helical shape, as the tobacco mosaic virus. And so this is a great example of a virus that infects not just humans, but also can affect plants and can infect different other organisms, other animals. And then our last and final virus that we saw is the spherical shape. And this is the one that we have seen a lot as it is associated with the coronavirus. The coronavirus is a spherical shaped type virus. Each of these viruses are going to be unique in how they attack a cell and how they actually interact with the cell. So before we kind of continue to build on our knowledge, let's take a history lesson. Let's step back, and so let's go to the next slide so that we can kind of look at the history of viruses. It's important to recognize that viruses have been around since the beginning of time. Scientists have been able to trace evidence of viruses to the formation of Earth. So viruses have been here for a very, very long time. And so we know that viruses can be harmful, and we know that there are viruses that will only affect certain organisms and aren't actually harmful at all. And so what we saw in the very beginning in 1892, that a Russian biologist first discovered the first piece of evidence that has contributed to our understanding of viruses today in the science community. He noticed that there was a liquid that was associated with a plant that was affected by the tobacco mosaic virus. And in 1897, a Dutch scientist continued to build on that understanding and recognized that in this particular particle, that it was a poison, or it was something that was harmful. And so he actually gave the name of virus to this fluid, to this liquid. And last but not least, another key point in history, we had an American biochemist who actually came along and identified that viruses are non-living particles. And that's a very important piece. While it may not seem like this matters or it's not a big deal, that actually is one of the main important pieces that helps to contribute to why we are in such a craze and why we are so worried about the coronavirus itself and all viruses. So as we kind of continue on, let's look and understand how viruses reproduce. How do we get mass reproduction of these little particles? So understand that viruses are non-living, and so that means they need help, they need assistance. In fact, they need a living host in order to reproduce. Viruses cannot do anything on their own. They have to have that living host. And so there are two major modes of reproduction. In short, viruses simply hijack a cell and they trick the cell into doing their business. So let's look at those two modes of reproduction in detail for just a second. the first mode of reproduction is a relatively short cycle, and we refer to this as the lytic cycle, or the lytic infection. In this particular reproduction mode, a virus will insert itself into a cell and will make copies of itself, so make more viruses until that actual cell will burst. It will explode, releasing all of those newly made viruses. And so those viruses will then go on to other cells and complete the same process. And the lysogenic cycle, or the lysogenic infection, this virus will actually trick the cell into doing serious damage. And the way that it tricks the cell is that it's going to insert its DNA or its RNA, its genetic material, into the cell and actually mix its information with the cell. So when the cell makes more copies of itself, we actually have cells that are composed of viral particles, of virus infections. And so what this means, or what this translates to, is that every time a new cell is made in an organism, that cell will carry out the function of that particular virus. An example that we know and that we've seen is HIV. HIV is actually what we call a retrovirus. And that simply means that instead of DNA, it uses RNA. But what makes this disease so deadly and such a big issue is that the cell actually not only makes more copies of itself, but it tells the immune system not to fight those cells. And so that is why HIV continues to be a proverbial thorn in our side. It makes it very difficult to cure, but we can treat it. And granted, we have made significant leaps and bounds in treating HIV, but it is this very complex lysogenic cycle that makes it very difficult for us to actually cure, and it continues to pose many challenges. So let's go ahead and keep going, and let's talk about some of these other diseases. And so viruses do cause disease. Not all viruses, but many viruses do cause disease. And so they do this by disrupting the body's natural way in which it functions. And so the fancy science word for that we like to say is homeostasis. So viruses disrupt the ability for a cell to maintain homeostasis. And when this happens, we tend to see the associated symptoms of the disease. So let's go ahead, let's take a real quick poll for me. So if we go to the next slide, you guys can go ahead, and I can't see the data, can you tell me the data? So that's coming up. Okay.
We got 80%, so we got somebody said false.
Good luck with that.
we got one person thinks it's false. We got some people who think it's true. It's an even split.
Okay.
But I don't know. I just don't think
So let's see if we can find our answer. Let's see if we can figure this out. So viruses are harmful and can cause a multitude of diseases. By virtue of their existence, viruses are infectious particles, meaning that they have to have a host cell. Sorry, there's so many distractions, as would be at home, right? Those of you at home, you can imagine what it's like to have distractions and kind of, whoa, what's going on? And these infectious particles are actually going to lead to different diseases such as genital warts or HPV, the common cold, the flu that we know, smallpox, Ebola. We have herpes, we have AIDS, we have chickenpox, we have rabies, and now we have the coronavirus. And so what's important to recognize is that these pathogens that are infecting a cell can actually do great damage. They can infect cells and cause cells to change the way they function. Another great example that we've seen of this is the poliovirus. The poliovirus, which we saw an epidemic of in the 20s and 30s.
Do not run next to that road.
In the 20s and 30s,
You need to mask up.
led to paralysis, and this is because the poliovirus was affecting the nervous cells, and so those nervous cells were no longer able to function the way that they needed to, and so we saw the common effect or symptom as paralysis. And so other viruses will also change cells, and they can change the way that those cells grow and develop and lead to cancer, and we've seen this in HPV. That is another example of a virus that actually can cause additional health problems. So what do we do? How do we treat viruses? What can we do in order to prevent viruses? What does that look like? Well, as I mentioned earlier, remember that viruses cannot be cured and they're not living organisms, but we can treat them. And so there are three major ways that I want to talk about how we tackle the fight of viruses. The first way is through the use of antivirals. Antivirals, not to be confused with antibiotics. Recognize that antibiotics are only going to work on bacteria because bacteria are living things. Antivirals have one main goal and one main purpose, and that is to simply suppress and inhibit the ability for that virus to reproduce. So instead of being able to continue to infect cells, or instead of being able to continue to make more viruses, that antiviral helps to stop that process. A second way in which we can tackle and fight viruses is our own natural body's defense, which is known as the immune system. And so that's why when you go to the doctor often will tell you rest. Get some rest, eat plenty of food, drink plenty of water, keep fluids in your body. They may offer you to take some over-the-counter herbal supplements such as antioxidants, vitamin C or elderberry. And that is because that helps to assist our immune system in doing its natural everyday function, what it was created for. It is uniquely crafted to help fight off any type of pathogen, whether it's viral or bacterial. And our third and final way that we treat a virus, and I should correct myself in saying prevent a virus, is through vaccinations. Vaccines have the sole purpose of helping to prevent a virus from infecting a person so that we don't have to worry about trying to take an antiviral or having to really help our immune system. And so we have seen that vaccines have been very useful and helpful in even eradicating some viruses here in the United States. It may not be global, but there are many diseases that we have actually been able to suppress and eradicate from the human population due to vaccines. And so let's see what happens when we don't have these preventable measures in place, or we don't have these natural defenses in place. I'm going to take us back on another history lesson, back to 1918, when we first saw the Spanish flu, also known as influenza A. The Spanish flu was very detrimental, and it was another global pandemic that we unfortunately experienced because we didn't have vaccinations in place, because the human body had not been in contact with this type of virus before. And so this is where the concept of emergent diseases comes into play. An emergent disease is very detrimental to the population because it's novel, it's new, it's something that has not been seen before, and sometimes it is something that has been evolved. So we may have seen it, but it's changed drastically from what we originally knew to be true. And as a result, that means that we don't have any control methods, we don't have the resistance in our immune system to be able to fight off that particular disease, that particular virus. And so unfortunately, we notice that we overwhelm our healthcare system. Unfortunately, we lose millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people globally, simply because we don't have the proper methods. And so this makes it imperative for us to understand how viruses work, how they operate, and what we need to do to quickly gain control to help stop a pandemic or an epidemic reaching the proportions that we have seen in the past and that we are currently seeing right now. So let's go ahead and talk about why that need for urgency, or that sense of urgency, exists. It exists in one major reason, one major influence for viruses, and it's the concept of evolution. Now, we've all heard of evolution, and we know about evolution, and we know that that means it's changing, things are changing, organisms, species are changing. And so how do we apply that to viruses? Well, remember when I told you guys, when we learned that viruses are not living? This is the very process that baffled the science community, because typically evolution only occurs in living organisms, or so we thought. And so the fact that evolution can occur in a non-living particle such as a virus makes it very deadly, makes it potentially very deadly and very dangerous. And so let's kind of direct our attention to this model that we have here so that we can really understand why evolution makes a sense of urgency so important. You'll notice that on the right of your screen, you'll see a model using the influenza virus. And so we have an example of an influenza virus that is transmitted through humans, and then we have an influenza virus that exists in birds. What happens in evolution is that we see that the same cell can be infected by both viruses. And through the process of reproduction, that genetic material is mixed, it's combined, it's mixed together. And as that virus begins to replicate or to make more copies of itself, we get different combinations of that virus. That means that these different viruses are going to have different functions. They're going to do different things. Some things that we've seen and that we know, and then some things we've never seen. And so examples of what these changes or these mutations that we may see can be drug resistance. We can actually have viruses that become resistant to an antiviral. We have seen this, unfortunately, in HIV. And this is why HIV drugs continually change and why each person is different. And there may need to be multiple drugs that are used to help that individual with HIV. High infectivity is another change or mutation that we can see from the combination and the evolving of a virus. And we are currently seeing this in the variants of COVID that are emerging today. And then another example is zoonosis, or the jumping from a different host. In other words, the movement from, let's say, a bird or a pig to a human, or vice versa. And of course, we know that that is huge. That is a massive change that can really turn the tides or turn the tables of whether or not we can stop this or whether or not it's going to present more challenges. And so as evolution occurs at a rapid rate, we see that these variants, these differences kind of come about. So let's take a look at another set of visuals. Let's look at some graphs. So we'll notice that there are two visuals on this side here. On the left side, we have the variants of COVID, and then on the right side, we have the variants of influenza. And I use the flu because, unfortunately, often that's what coronavirus is compared to, and so I want to help dispel misinformation. But I also want to drive home the point of how a disease or how a virus evolves. Notice that on the right side, we have multiple variants of the flu. And not only do we see multiple variants of the flu, but we see that in any given individual, any given type of bird, there can be different variants of that flu, which further drives home the point of that mixing and matching of the genetic material, which creates the variants that we see. Some of these variants can be more lethal than the others. Some of these variants may be very similar, and some of these variants are going to be novel and new, and nothing that we have, no control method that we have in place is going to help, and we have to start from scratch, much like what we had to do with COVID-19. And so on the left side, you guys will notice the three variants that we have been able to identify currently with COVID-19. And this really goes to show how quickly and how easily viruses are able to carry out this process. So what are the complications, or what comes with this? Why does this matter? Why do we care? Why is this so important? Well, we'll notice that with the variants we've seen that high infectivity. And so again, that's a result of those changes and those mutations that have occurred as the virus has evolved. The other piece that we have is we're worried, we're not quite sure if the variants that we see are going to be able to be recognized by the antibodies that exist in people that have already had the virus. And just very quickly, antibodies are those things that are left over in a person that has fought off a virus. And so what this essentially means is that a variant may not be able to be fought off by the body because those antibodies don't match. There's no recognition, so there's no way for the body to say, "Ooh, remember what you did 2 weeks ago or 6 months ago or a year ago? You got to do that now." There's no way for the immune system to be able to do so. And last but not least, it's the unknown. And when I say the unknown, I mean the unknown of the short-term and long-term complications or effects on different cohorts in the human population. So we don't know what this means for different age groups in the population. We don't know what this means for different ethnicities in the population. We don't know what this means for different socioeconomic groups in the population. And more importantly, the hard work that many countries, the science community has put into play with trying to stop COVID, we don't know if these new variants are going to respond to that. And so we may end up having to start all over again at step 1 or part A before we can really tackle these variants as they're coming along. And so that is just the science of the piece. That's not even taking into account the worries and the concerns and the pressure from society as we know exists with this today. So I hope I've been able to kind of give you guys a different point of view, a different perspective, kind of show you guys a little different understanding about the coronavirus and the virus from a biological standpoint, from a scientific standpoint. I guess if there are any questions, maybe drop them on social media or whatnot.
Yeah.
I'm by no means a certified infectious disease person, but I can definitely kind of speak to and kind of answer any questions concerning the science.
Yeah.
And that's what I have for you guys. I hope I didn't bore you too much. Thank you so much.
That was so cool. So the part that really amazed me was when you were talking about the viruses that were getting into the birds, and it kind of reminded me of what was going on with swine flu.
Yes.
Right?
100%.
So I mean, I didn't even realize you could have a situation where 2 viruses literally like came together in a single cell and reproduced a new monster virus.
Yes, and that is essentially what has happened with the COVID variants, is that people somehow, some way have been exposed to different strains of COVID, and as a result, as those viruses continue to multiply and replicate, we now see these mutations that have been very beneficial to the virus itself. There are some mutations that actually make the virus less effective, but unfortunately what we're seeing is that these mutations are making the virus very effective.
Wow.
And because an evolutionary benefit of a virus is they need a living host, they tend to have those changes in that natural evolution because they need to continue to outsmart the host so that they can stay alive and continue to move around.
And it sounds like the more we are not careful and the more we allow more exposure, it sounds like we're just making it evolve faster. It's like a horrible Pokemon.
Yeah. Yes. The more different types of environments that the virus is able to come and connect to. Think about Darwin's theory of natural selection, right? Survival of the fittest. So if I'm in multiple environments and I am finding that I can survive in this environment, I can survive in this environment, and that may translate to different temperatures of the body, different acidity, so basic or acidic environments in the body, then those viruses that have survived those different environments will continue to go on to reproduce. And so they become the ones that become more challenging to help to fight off because they have adapted so well to many different environments.
Wow. That is so incredible. Thank you so much.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Anytime, I love it.